After rescuing the lion cub, the man becomes surrounded by the entire pride, and what happens is simply astounding. The murky waters of the Mara River reached David Thompson's chest as he fought against the current. On his shoulders, a lion cub clung desperately, trembling and on the verge of collapse. Just a few minutes earlier, David, a 34-year-old nature photographer, was preparing his equipment on the riverbank when he witnessed something that would change his life forever. A small lion cub had been swept away by the current, completely helpless. The cub, only about 4 months old, had been playing too close to the bank when the ground gave way under its paws. Its desperate cry pierced the dawn's tranquility. Heavy rain that had fallen upstream during the night had transformed the river into a deadly trap. David, who had been documenting wildlife in Kenya's Masai Mara Reserve for 8 years, had always respected the golden rule: never interfere. But in that moment, his human instinct prevailed over his training as a photographer. Without thinking, twice he dropped his camera and plunged into the river. The rescue was nearly fatal. The current was violent, full of invisible debris. A submerged log struck his arm with force, leaving him stunned. But his determination to save the cub gave him the strength he needed. When he finally managed to reach it, the small, exhausted and frightened creature clung to his neck with surprising strength. David could feel its heart beating frantically against his chest as he fought to return to shore. What David didn't know was that hidden among the nearby trees, 5 adult lionesses were watching his every move. They were part of the cub's pride, desperately searching for it after losing sight of it. Guided by its cries of despair, they had tracked it here and arrived just in time to witness the rescue scene. When David finally reached the shallower area, panting and exhausted, he looked up and his heart stopped. The entire pride had surrounded him. There were not only the 5 lionesses, but also a huge male lion, his dark mane flowing in the wind, all in a semicircle, watching in silence. David had no escape. He was trapped with water still up to his waist and the cub in his arms. He knew that any false move could trigger a deadly attack. However, something unexpected happened. The largest lioness, clearly the matriarch, took a step forward. David held his breath. He knew how fiercely protective they could be with their young, but in this lioness's eyes there was no threat or anger. For the first time in all his years as a photographer, he saw something different: recognition, perhaps even gratitude. The cub weakly mewed, calling to its pride. That small sound seemed to break the tension of the moment, and then something incredible happened. The matriarch approached. Her enormous paws cut through the water in gentle waves as she moved forward, tensing every muscle as if she were about to attack. But she didn't. She stopped less than a meter from David and bowed her head. It was a gesture he could only interpret as an act of respect. Against all predictions, in the wild heart of Mara, a momentary bond was forged between 2 species that normally never cross paths without violence. And thanks to an action camera that was recording automatically, everything was captured. The lioness's gesture lasted several seconds. During that moment of absolute silence, the remaining pride members remained motionless, as if they were witnessing a ceremony laden with deep meaning. When the matriarch raised her head, her eyes made direct contact with David's. It wasn't the wild gaze of a predator stalking its prey, but a steady gaze, intense like someone who recognizes an equal. In David's arms, the cub began to move with more energy, extending its small paws toward its mother while making gentle chirping sounds. She responded with soft chuffs, the same ones lionesses use to calm and communicate with their young during feeding and grooming. "You're okay, little one. Your family is here," David whispered, barely audible above the river's roar. As if she understood, the matriarch took another step toward him. David's heart beat forcefully, pounding against his ribs, but something in the lioness's posture told him he wasn't in danger. Her approach was cautious, deliberate, and completely peaceful. What happened next would be the subject of study among ethologists and biologists for years. The matriarch came even closer, until David could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. For several moments she simply observed him with her penetrating amber eyes. She seemed to be analyzing him, not just for his presence, but for something deeper: his intentions, his character. his act of saving one of theirs. And then she did something never before documented in wild lion behavior. She began to groom him. Her rough tongue brushed David's forehead in a maternal gesture, the same one she reserved for members of her pride. It was a clear act, impossible to misinterpret. She was accepting him, albeit temporarily, as part of her family. David didn't move. He barely dared to breathe as one of the planet's most feared predators offered him such a profound display of trust that challenged everything he thought he knew about wildlife. The grooming lasted barely half a minute, but its significance was unmistakable. The pride understood this too. From that moment, David was no longer a threat, no longer prey. He was a man who had risked his life to save one of theirs. One by one, the other lionesses approached, showing calm, even curious body language instead of aggressive. Finally, the huge male lion, who had been watching from a distance, approached, walking slowly to the water's edge, crouched down, and adopted a relaxed posture in a clear signal that he approved of what was happening. The tension dissipated. With great caution, David began moving toward the shore, still with the cub in his arms. To his amazement, the pride parted, opening a passage for him as if creating an honor guard. They no longer saw him as an intruder. Reaching solid ground, David slowly knelt and placed the cub on the earth. The reaction was immediate. The matriarch ran to it, sniffing it urgently and beginning to lick it, checking its condition while purring with relief. The other lionesses also approached, taking turns examining and reconnecting with the little one. The last to approach was the male lion. He lowered his enormous head and gently touched the cub with his nose. David, still kneeling and soaked, watched the scene in silence. He should have felt fear, being surrounded by 6 of Africa's most powerful predators, but instead he felt honored. He was witnessing something few people could ever imagine, true emotional bonds in a lion family. Later, when Dr. Sarah Becky, a biologist specializing in wildlife, reviewed the images captured by David's camera, she was amazed. The lioness's behavior, she explained, is normally reserved exclusively for pride members, that a wild lioness showed. This gesture toward a human meant a level of cognitive recognition and gratitude that challenged the very foundations of what was known about big cats. As the pride gathered around the rescued cub, David tried to carefully withdraw, wanting to give them space without disturbing the intimate moment. But the lions had other plans. When he began to move away, the matriarch looked up from her young and made a sound David had never heard before. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a deep, soft call, almost conversational. Immediately, the remaining group members stood up and took positions in formation, leaving David breathless at what was about to happen. The lions arranged themselves in 2 parallel lines, creating a clear path from where David stood to the acacia tree, where his photographic equipment waited. It was a solemn escort, like an authentic honor guard protecting his safe passage away from the river. "This is impossible," David whispered, his voice captured by the waterproof microphone that was still recording every second. They were leading him to safety. The matriarch took leadership, positioning herself to his right, while the imposing male lion moved to his left. The 4 remaining lionesses flanked them, maintaining perfect alignment as they began a slow and ceremonial walk. David, at the center of this extraordinary procession, surrounded by some of the planet's most powerful predators, was neither threat nor prey. He was a guest of honor. The cub, already recovered, ran joyfully beside its mother. From time to time it turned its head to look at David, with an expression that seemed more curiosity than fear. Every few steps the little one rubbed against his leg in a gesture of closeness that left David speechless. When they reached the place where his equipment waited, the group stopped. The matriarch approached David one last time, slightly bowed her enormous head, and studied him in silence. Then, in a gesture that would become viral on social media worldwide, she gently pressed her forehead to his. It was the same greeting lions use with members of their closest group. "Thank you," David whispered. "Thank you for trusting me." The matriarch stepped back and made a soft chuff, a sound that communicated satisfaction and farewell. One by one, the remaining group members approached David to briefly touch him with their noses or rub against his legs. Even the huge male lion participated, gently bumping David's arm with his head. The last to say goodbye was the rescued cub. It sat right in front of David, raised its small head, and made a soft mew, as if it were a thank you. David crouched down and petted it one last time. Both seemed to understand that this moment would never be repeated. The pride departed toward the distant trees, seeking shade for their evening rest. David remained there, soaked, surrounded by his equipment, and completely overwhelmed by what he had just experienced. To his surprise, his action camera had captured every moment of the encounter. Later, wildlife experts would authenticate the images. Animal behaviorists would analyze them, and they would appear in documentaries worldwide. Renowned Dr. Jane Goodall would later declare that it was one of the most remarkable samples of interspecies communication and gratitude ever recorded. But for David, no technical analysis had greater meaning than the profound truth he experienced. On that muddy shore, surrounded by wild lions that should instinctively have perceived him as a threat, he had witnessed something that science is only beginning to understand: the true capacity for gratitude and recognition beyond the barriers between species. The rescued cub grew up under the protection of its pride. David continued his photographic work in the Masai Mara Reserve, and on several occasions encountered the same group of lions again. Each time the matriarch greeted him with a soft chuff, and the now adult lion he had rescued approached his vehicle without fear, sometimes even resting under its shade. Local guides began calling the young lion David's brother, or simply the lion that, albeit briefly, adopted him. Inspired by his story, tourism companies began offering David Thompson tours, hoping to recreate some of the magic of that encounter, although nothing ever came close to the extraordinary connection he experienced. Dr. Sarah Becky founded the Thompson Mara Research Foundation, dedicated to studying the cognitive and emotional capabilities demonstrated by this pride during the rescue. In her own words, this experience proved that the boundaries between human and animal consciousness are much more blurred than we thought. "Who could have imagined it?" she wrote in one of her reports. "What we witnessed was not simply animal behavior. It was an expression of values we considered exclusively human: gratitude, honor, moral recognition." David Thompson, who began that day with the simple goal of photographing wildlife, ended up experiencing an event that changed his life forever. It was a reminder that compassion is a universal language, spoken and understood by creatures we are only beginning to understand.